welcome. I'm Abbie. You are listening to Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. Our communication creates our social worlds. By that, I mean we make choices in every moment about how we communicate, how we show up to each other, the stories they tell, and what they mean to us. We do this whether we realize it or not, but when we do start to pay attention, we can see how each of these choices helps move toward creating a better social world. This is called social construction. It means that we as humans shape the communities, the societies, and the relationships that we live in. So let's go back to that paying attention part. In today's conversation and every conversation on this podcast, we're learning to pay attention by hearing different stories and engaging with new ways of using a communication perspective. Today, our conversation partner is Zev Burton. Zev and I actually met about 6 years ago doing high school speech, so I'm excited to get to catch up with him and hear his story today, and specifically how he is using his unique perspective to create a better social world. Zev graduated from Georgetown with a bachelor's in international security and is currently working on his master's in data science and analysis. He has written a book, Two Fish in a Tank: How Jokes Can Give Hope to a Fractured World, and he uses TikTok to discuss important social issues. As someone who exists heavily in the world of data, Zev offers us a totally different perspective than one that I could offer. But through this conversation, we realize that our experiences are really not that different after all. We keep coming back to themes of making meaning, considering context, and finding ways to look at communication rather than through it. There's a lot of value to be found in this conversation for sure. I'm so glad you're choosing to join us in it today. So let's jump right in. Hey, Zev, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here, Abbie. I'm just thrilled to be here, of course.
I appreciate that, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you. And so I guess I'll start with some context for the people. Is that, would it have been like 6 years ago when we met?
So I knew who you were from my freshman year of high school, but I don't think we actually met until 6 years ago. I think you're right, our junior year.
Yeah. So in the wonderful world of competitive speech, informative speaking, I guess I've just been thinking about it in preparation for this conversation because I think that speech probably really was where my just love affair with language and words started, because it was like a game to me. I loved writing my own speeches and playing around with the words to come up with like the best way to say something or the most effective way to say something. And I had a hard time, that since we mostly did informative speaking, to not get too passionate about it since I was just supposed to be informative. But I guess to kind of start, I was wondering what you felt like. What did you get out of doing speech in high school? Has that stuck with you?
In some ways not.
Yeah.
It is the reason I have met a lot of people, because you can, now that you do it, you can kind of point to a speech person like across the room and be like, oh, that person did speech. I mostly focused on debate in high school, and speech was kind of the latter half of the year just because of Indiana. It split very much. But the big thing is, how can you both use words to convince, use words well, use words to get stuff across, and also, and this is kind of my own philosophy when it came to it, use words to be entertaining when you are limited by your circumstances.
Yeah.
I think now, like, fully presenting is half of what I do, whether it be through school, through online, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to come up in our conversation later too, for sure. Okay, but well, we haven't spoken in years and years and years, so catch us up, please. Where are you now? What are you up to?
After high school in lovely Indiana, I decided to escape, which I'm very fortunate to have. Went to Georgetown for undergrad, studied international security with a focus on Russian and mathematics. And then I was doing a lot of research with regards to statistics and measuring what do mass murders look like in the US. That was like the big project I was working with this professor on. Eventually, like, we spent 3 years on it. We kind of came to some cool conclusions. We were writing the paper at some point, and she said, hey, I got a book deal because I invented a new branch of statistics. Dr. Kimberly Sellers, she's wonderful, amazing in so many ways.
Wow.
And she said to me, by the way, I signed you up for the 5-year master's program in data science. And she kind of asked me about it first, and she was like, hey, I'm pointing you towards this. And I had to get permission, go through, because I was in the School of Foreign Service. We don't do math there. And then kind of ended up doing that. of course, at the same time, I was also looking into TikTok, social media, particularly from an academic perspective, because it was fascinating to me. I was
Yeah.
fascinated how militaries use it, how
Mm.
insurgent groups use social media. But also now I am finishing up my final semester of my master's program in data science, where I focus a lot on the communication of data, data insights, and data visualizations.
Fascinating. Probably important context to have for the rest of the conversation. Can you explain what is the field of international security? What is data science and analysis?
So, international security is, in my view, keeping people safe, especially within a nation. The most poignant example is, of course, like the military. The military protects the borders and the people of the United States, or that's what they're supposed to do.
Mhm.
Theoretically, that was most of my undergrad debating when are we supposed to and stuff like that. But it also involves, okay, how do we work with other countries? How do we work within the global sphere to advance the interests of our nation, to advance the interests of the world, stuff
Mhm.
like that. And then data science is a complete 180 from that.
Yeah.
I wasn't that interested in writing the same essay about World War One over and over again.
Mm.
Because like there have only been a few big wars
Yeah.
that we in the West like to focus on. But data science is taking it pretty much what the name implies. Basically taking a lot of data,
Mhm.
whether it be from databases, whether it be from all of the apps tracking us, and finding some sort of insight into it, whether those insights be what we call descriptive, which is describing the statistics, or predictive, which is
Mm.
predicting, okay, if we go after Abbie Van Meter in Indiana, what kind of consumer is she going to be? What's she buying
Mhm.
at Target? And stuff like that.
Yeah. So do you feel like you've kind of left the world of international security behind for the data science analysis, or in your mind, do they go hand in hand for you?
Historically, they have not gone hand in hand. There's been a lot more focus on, hey, let's be diplomatic with other countries. Let's focus on human connection, which is a good thing. Don't get me wrong. But particularly when it comes to other forms of international affairs, when it comes to predicting the rise of insurgent groups, when it comes to
Mm.
trade and stuff like that, I'm doing a big project right now on the conductors, the little pieces of technology that we need to get into space. Like, where do we get that from in the US? There's a lot of opportunity there for the mix of data science and international affairs that I don't think is explored yet,
Yeah.
or it's explored by like a few people in strange institutions. And there are like three names in the field
Uh-huh.
right now. And
You're going to be the fourth.
oh, that's horrifying. But no, it's so unexplored. There's so much to explore
Hmm.
where it is harder because I can't like go read a book on it and learn about it. I have to actually do it myself,
Hmm.
which to me is cool, but I understand it's not as appealing to most people in their early
Yeah.
20s.
Obviously, data affects every minute of everyone's lives almost, like you said, people probably know more about me than I know about me that could pay attention to data and understand that. So I think it's interesting that that's something that you said is kind of unexplored, that connection, at least, that intersection that you're finding yourself in. Has it changed like the way that you are a consumer, or, how you are like an individual person, the work that you do around data?
Yes. So Target collects a ton of data on all of us, especially with regards to what we purchase, but also them and Walmart are currently working on like people tracking, like where are people going within the store? And they haven't
Interesting.
gotten it down to the individual level yet,
Hmm.
but that's the next logical step. And it's like to make sure, okay, some people are going from food to electronics. Those are the opposite sides of the store. And what they do is they build consumer profiles,
Hmm.
which anyone who's in sales knows what that is. It's just like, what type of consumer is this person?
Sure.
And then they can target ads to you. They can send you targeted emails. And that's not meant to scare. It's meant like,
Uh-huh.
it's taught as a lesson, as like all the things you know, like we can't exist in a data vacuum. But like when I go to Target now, I'm like, what kind of person am I?
Mm.
What label have they given me? Like, how do I shop? And it's more of a curiosity thing where it isn't impacting a lot of what I do.
Hmm.
Like, I'm not going to go, haha, I'm going to go get some adult diapers to throw them off their game. No, but it's a lot of curiosity about okay, I know these tools exist. I
Mhm.
know how to build them. I know the backend. How is it being deployed? Because usually they won't tell us.
Right. Yeah. It's not maybe like public information. That's maybe why more people do. You'd have to, be you and be getting a master's degree in data science to have access to that kind of information. How do you feel about that as someone who gets to maybe see some of the insides or behind the scenes of that? Is that like scary? Do you feel like data is empowering? Do you see it being handled ethically? What are those kind of conversations that you're a part of around that?
I think the question isn't in my mind, and this has changed kind of constantly. I go back and forth, is the collection of data, the focus on data is not inherently bad.
Mm-hmm.
I think we hear this stuff about, oh, if the government's tracking you, companies are tracking you, Apple knows everything you do on your computer. And I'm not convinced that in itself is bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's the use of that data that's bad.
Absolutely.
Like Google had an AI ethics team for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
They fired them all last year.
Oh my God.
The same thing goes for Facebook. Facebook had a AI accountability group. They have lost basically all funding, and I believe they're now down
Mm.
to just one person.
Well, that's a step in the wrong direction.
Right. The collection of data is not inherently bad,
Yeah.
but when you don't have people who are a check on the unmitigated use of data and analysis,
Mm-hmm.
reminding decision makers, hey, you know those numbers? Those are actual people with actual feelings
Mm-hmm.
and actual like ideas. And like there's the old saying, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Okay.
And it's kind of like, no, your model can't tell us everything about people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very unethical to rely only on the model.
As someone who's on the outside of things, as a consumer, someone who is, using technology, interacting with different systems that would be collecting data, I think the part that is probably really at the forefront of a lot of the conversations right now, because maybe the laws have not caught up to how quickly technology has evolved, is that the unethical parts that I'm maybe most aware of. I think about YouTube autoplay. I think about different things that Netflix does. I think about social media and, the way that those platforms are designed to be addictive, to take so much of your time. And the question hasn't been asked like, oh, is this healthy? Like you're saying, for the people behind these numbers, because a lot of it is like, how are we profiting? Not how are we
Yes.
affecting the very real lives of people on the other side of these screens?
And you say everything is designed to keep us on there, keep us looking at ads. It's literally
Mm-hmm.
if you look at it, every single social media site is the same shade of like light blue
Mm-hmm.
because it's been scientifically proven to make us feel calm, to make us
Mm-hmm.
stay on the site. Terrifying.
What first made you interested in getting into the fields of data science and analysis?
It was honestly that first project I did with Dr. Sellers, where we were looking at. So a lot of the research on mass murders ends around 2016.
Mm.
No one really knows why. I think like the academia hype around it kind of stopped.
Interesting.
And we were curious, okay, what's going on the last 3 years? Where there's been a lot more push in terms of activism to call out stuff. The media environment's changed a lot. What does this look like? And it was a lot of manual data collection. It was a lot of very sad manual data
Mm.
collection, just because like inputting age of victim 0 is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And we went through all the data and we ended up presenting at a few conferences saying like, hey, we have this idea that mass murders take place, like the one in Las Vegas, like Sandy Hook, like
Mm-hmm.
the list goes on and on.
Right.
But that's like, while terrible, we also need to think about the issue of domestic mass murders, where it's something like 70 to 80% of all mass murders, which definitionally is 4 or more people killed, excluding the perpetrator, happen in the house.
Wow.
By always, and I do mean always, like from those 3 years, always the male figure in the house. I say that because without actually going in and looking at the data, I would have been staying on this line. Like the real thing we need to stop is school shootings. We need to
Mm-hmm.
stop big event shootings. And we also need to focus on something that's in the data, but not in the conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that data is adding more nuance into the conversation that wasn't there before.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of our perspectives on stuff, as we know, is dictated by media, what we consume. And what we consume is the flashy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's nothing flashy about local man kills wife and 3 children.
Mm-hmm.
It's heartbreaking, but like,
Interesting. So as you've learned more and gotten more into this field, is it been like for you that this kind of vague interest in the world of data science has blossomed into more of a passion for it? Or is passion the wrong word?
I am very worried to say, oh, I am passionate about data because that makes me sound like a awful Silicon Valley startup guy.
I guess my question really is, are you passionate about the way we can use data to do X, Y, or Z in the world, whatever you would fill in the blank there?
I think that's more of the right phrasing. And like my passion is about like making the world better, making the world safer in particular, because people won't make art if like they're under their seats just fearful of a nuclear bomb coming. I mean, you can look at the photos of the Cold War and understand that. And I think data is a very underused tool when it comes to public service. And so the passion is less about data, like, oh, no one loves, even the smartest people that I've ever met in the field of data science, no one likes looking at data. Like, it's gross. It's a bunch of numbers that don't really mean anything, but they can provide such insights into making the world a better place. Like, I'm part of this group called Statistics Without Borders, which is a Doctors Without Borders, like adjacent, where it's like going into countries and saying, hey, we understand there isn't a lot of data going on. Let's help out with surveys. Let's help out with analyzing the data. Let's help you out for free because data can be such a powerful vector for change.
I do see, you know, the world that you exist in, the way that everything that you seem to be doing as just a different path into the same place that like I'm trying to get. The specific language that I use in this podcast, and that comes from the communication theory, coordinated management and meaning, is that we, through our communication, are building better social worlds, or we have the ability to build better social worlds when we start communicating better. And that's talking about the stories. It's talking about the patterns we find ourselves in. How are we relating to each other? How are we showing up? All these things. And I do see a piece of the path to a better social world of being this piece that you're bringing in.
Well, half of it is just communicating the data.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean anything if you can't explain what happened. A big, big focus right now in the field is on what's called data storytelling, which is communicating the data in a way that is entertaining and keeps people engaged. Because if I go up there with like a bunch of line charts that make no sense, it's not fun. If I go up there with a story to start off, to humanize it, it's so much more interesting. You get across your point better, especially for who I deal with a lot, people in the political sphere. Like, they say they like their charts. No, they like saying that they like charts.
Yeah. I mean, that's funny because I'm thinking about what you do. I was like, gosh, Zev must just have a very different brain than I have. You know, all these people that do deal with data just maybe think in a different way. And to some extent, that probably is true. But what is also true is that all of the people that probably are people that you work with that do similar things to what you do are also human beings, and all human beings exist in our lives are stories. And so you can't separate that from the data. And
without a doubt.
Yeah. And even what you said a second ago, you're like, okay, I have a bunch of numbers. They don't mean anything. And I think the true statement there is that they don't mean anything until we make them mean something, which is that we're always attaching meaning to everything. And I think through the way that you've talked about things is that you're in this world of using the data, analyzing the data, making better social worlds from the data. And then I think it sounds like you also have this perspective where you like to step out of that and almost zoom out and look at yourself and look at the world you're existing in to try to understand it and put it into a framework.
The world's cool, dude. Like, I don't know how to explain it other than that. There are so many cool things about the world, stuff I don't understand, stuff I want to understand. Like, I'm a big book reader, and my favorite book of all time is a book on eels. Like it's just called The Book of Eels by Patrick Spencer. And it's the greatest book in the world.
What makes it the greatest book in the world?
If you can combine one, eels. We know nothing about eels. We don't know how they reproduce. We don't know. I'm going to avoid just data dumping. There's so much we don't know about them. And the way that the author, Patrick Spencer, communicates that in saying there's a combination of we don't know much about them. Historically, we tried so hard to figure it out. And 3, he tells the story of, I remember hunting for eels, eel fishing with my father, who just passed. And it's like humanizing, which is exactly what we were just talking about, humanizing what can be so dry if done incorrectly. Because like, I don't want to read a scientific paper on eels.
Sure.
No one does except 6 people who are really into it.
Yeah.
But when you add in that human element, you add in the story behind it, the story behind why we don't know anything, the story behind the communities that have been built around eels and like eel soup and stuff like that. It's just so beautifully done in that book in a way that I didn't expect.
Yeah, it's less about the content of the eels and more about the way that it could have probably been any topic, but if it was told in that kind of storied way, it'd be engaging.
Without a doubt. I've got a book on my desk right now about the 1940s census. There's so much cool things about the world. And I think data can allow us to see that in a lot of times ways that qualitative accounts can't. But also qualitative accounts allow for the humanization, which you can't get through data. So the best approach is to do both.
I would consider myself a zooming out person too. Like I love to kind of connect the dots of things. And I think of my life like that. If I see different themes that have, happened over my life or different stories that I've taken in that have led me to be who I am. And so on a personal level in my life, I like to zoom out. And then in the world, there's zooming out to see probably what you're looking at through data is like patterns. And I think that's just super fascinating, but that's good language that you used at the end there is that where I exist in my zooming out is probably a really purely qualitative approach to things because I don't have the expertise or the knowledge to talk data. But, whether you are taking that quantitative or qualitative approach, like you said, they both have, I think, a lot of value to add to your understanding of what you're looking at.
I don't think it's fair to say that people are focused like on qualitative and they don't really think about quantitative because quantitative isn't just numbers. Like it's also very much our minds, we often think in probability.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe implicitly. But Annie Duke has a great book called Thinking in Bets that kind of goes over this. But it's like, hey, what's the weather outside? Okay, if it is raining outside, if it's raining, then we grab an umbrella. Then we wear our rain boots. And I don't like the term quantitative as much as a lot of people. People use it, so I use it. But I think there's a difference between quantitative, which evokes feelings of numbers, just raw numbers, and logical, which is more what I think math is based off of, what a lot of things are based off of. Computing and algorithms are obviously based off of, but also decision making is often very logically based. And that's a hot take in the field of data science. And I've gotten flack for it before, being like, oh, a data scientist who doesn't like numbers. But the idea that when we communicate about numbers, when we think about numbers, is solely about numbers, which I understand is a very strange quote, is so limiting. Because really it's about the logic that underlies it, if that makes sense. I understand this is still very theoretical.
It's cool to hear what you're saying because I'm finding it so easy to kind of like copy and paste things that I already talk about all the time or think ways that I think about things into this world that you're helping bring me into of data science, international relations, all these things, that we're just going to keep talking about how there is meaning making that happens even in the world of data, and that's a huge thing relationally, I think, and communicatively to be able to say what you have in front of you. Really, I would go so far as to say nothing that is sitting in front of you has meaning innately baked into it. Every single thing we have attached the meaning to. We have said this means
I'd agree with that.
Yeah. And I think about that in a very like social sense. And it seems to be just as true in the world of numbers, in the world of logical thinking and problem solving, in the world of politics.
100%.
That's cool.
Especially in the world of politics, where communication and the ability to communicate your thoughts is a lot.
Yeah. I was excited, to learn and look more into different things that you're doing on TikTok, all these different things that you're studying, all these ways that you're putting yourself in these situations to be a part of some big conversations. But the first thing that made me think that you'd be a great guest was your book, Two Fish in a Tank, because it was so clear to me how that was taking a communication perspective, specifically talking about how we're communicating around humor and how we're using humor as a tool to communicate. Tell me about your book. What was that process like for you? Where does that idea come from? What does what it's all about mean to you?
So this was originally a conversation I had with a business school professor, strangely enough, who studies organizational psychology and how businesses react to bad times, especially when with regards to the culture inside of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, but why not use humor? And he said, no, you can't use humor when people are getting fired. And I was like, that's fair.
That's fair.
But then we started talking about, okay, how does humor play into the role that people face, especially when they're under oppression? Because during very serious times, why does like a joke land? Why do people make jokes? Why over and over again? And it becomes sort of a philosophical versus history lens. And we started looking into it. And he said, hey, I've got a connection with a publisher in town. If you write the book, I'll connect you. If COVID had just started, I had a lot of time. And I was like, all right, listen, this is interesting. I like learning about it. I spent a lot of times discussing with Holocaust survivors about what it was like in the camps, why they kept making jokes in the camp all the time. And over again, I kept seeing this constant of humor being used as a response to oppression, which is a very strange tool that we never really think of.
Yeah.
But you find like whether it's from like the Holocaust, where Jewish people in the camps would make fun of the guards, would make fun of Hitler all the time. Any attempt to shut that down is usually hilarious.
Yeah.
The greatest story of all time is in like 2010 in Serbia. They had a dictator, Milosevic. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Dictator was awful, like truly just repressive, horrendous. And these two guys, the founders of a group called Otpor, which would come to fruition after this, put a oil barrel in the middle of the town square, put the dictator's face on it, and just left a baseball bat and waited to see what would happen. Within an hour, people are lined up around the block to take the baseball bat and hit it in the dictator's face.
Interesting.
And so naturally, the police get called because the dictator's like, hey, I'm being disrespected, shut this down. How do you shut that down? What they decided to do was arrest the barrel and take the barrel away. My favorite picture of all time is these two police officers struggling to fit an oil barrel in the back of their police car.
That's wild.
And that photo was taken and spread like wildfire. And it was a wonderful example of how repressive this nation is. It just backfired on them.
Yeah.
Or there was a Russian protest in 2008 saying, oh my God, there's going to be this huge protest against Putin, against the oligarchs. They publicize everyone, go out, support this protest, do what you can. And so naturally the police and like the government shows up, and it's all teddy bears with signs that say like, fuck Putin in Russian. And the police officers didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
So they just took all the teddy bears and put them in a jail cell. Like,
interesting.
And over again, we see when we use humor, we are able to subvert oppression in a very strange way. And that's what the book is fundamentally about. It's this idea that we can use humor as a tool against oppression because they cannot fight back without making it worse. I dub that the political humor paradox.
Yeah, the other word that's coming to mind when you describe those stories is it's humor and it's absurdity. And I think that is a powerful tool in our lives. It makes sense almost that when faced with incredibly heavy things in our own personal lives, or like you're saying on a global scale and a political scale, oppressive systems, that absurdity is one way through that. Yeah, there's different ways probably to use absurdity or use humor. Some are maybe more tasteful than others. But I think it's interesting that you're able to analyze the humor in the specifically, you know, the world of international relations, the world of politics. Is there anything from your time writing your book that you learned that was most interesting or fascinating or insightful to you?
Oh, we are able to have the documents from a lot of the Holocaust. And I'm Jewish, if the name Zev didn't give that away. I know you know that, Abbie, but just for your listeners,
Yeah.
we have a lot of recollection. And a lot of what people talk about is what they talk about in the camps. And how did they, on the brink of death, when starved, hungry, horrified, scared, everything, how did they survive? And the phrase that kept popping up was, humor is how we survive. Because there's a very long history of Jewish comedy. I've got a book about it on my desk right now. So utilizing humor as a way of lifting spirits, of gaining optimism. Going into this, I was like, why does Holocaust stuff keep popping up? Is that like Google knows I'm Jewish, so it's like, hey,
right,
give them that?
One use of data.
Exactly. I kept popping up, and I got to talk to a few Holocaust survivors. I asked, like, why? What's going on here? Because this doesn't make any sense logically. And they were like, no, it makes perfect sense logically. What were we supposed to do? Wallow in self-pity? No. There's a term called gallows humor, which encompasses this very well. And it's making light of a bad situation in an attempt to lift up spirits. And over again, seeing like when people first got to Auschwitz, the concentration camp, the guards would cut their hair as an attempt to remove their humanity. And one girl went up at the beginning and thanked the guard and said, thank you for the haircut. I've been needing one. I haven't gotten one in a few years. Honestly, it's just going to be so much easier with shorter hair or with no hair, which is hilarious in and of itself. And the guard had no clue what to do.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
Which kind of is a bit of absurdist humor.
Yeah. Well, it's just like subverting the expectation of, which is, I think, you know, if you study the anatomy of jokes, a lot of it is like establishing a pattern and then breaking that pattern, right? And that's where the humor is, why we find that funny, because it's a subversion of what we expected. And so that in and of itself is a subversion of the expectation, because I'm going to bring us back to meaning here, because the meaning that was supposed to be attached to that moment was your humanity is being taken away from you. But again, that is a constructed meaning. That's not innate. And so this person was able to say a different meaning. And that was probably a really hard thing to do. It's not as light as, you know, just that story makes it sound. But it was an act of like reclaiming human dignity, almost, to say, I'm actually choosing to attach a different meaning for my own survival, for my own sake.
Without a doubt. I think like that's why you see this history, especially with regards to Jewish humor, just because that's what I know. Humor allows a reframing to occur. Yeah. A reframing of meaning. Exactly as you were talking about. And that doesn't just help externally with regards to, oh, I'm going to like make this being different than everyone else. But inside our mind, there are actual physical changes that happen. And it's the same thing, like you hear people talk about, oh, optimism all the time. Like optimism, you got to stay positive. I think that is a lot of corporate marketing at work. Yeah.
It's very surface level, it feels.
Little bit.
Yeah.
But humor does a very similar thing in a very tangible way of, it's not just making a joke, it is reframing a mindset. Yeah. To go from defeated to haha, which is a very large swing.
Yeah. I think that's fascinating and not something I've really thought about before. But I think, I just think that's incredible perspective. Even like the first 2 pages of your book, I was already like, wow, there's something to this. You know, you're onto something for sure. I appreciated the frame that you were putting on it, which felt like kind of using your classmates' questions towards you, was asking this question, posing the question to yourself, to us as readers, what value does humor add in understanding political relationships, political goings-ons? because you were saying, I get some of my news from comedians who are talking about what's going on. And obviously you need the actual facts in there as well. But what nuance does it add to also look at it from the perspective of humor, from the perspective of comedians who are adding that layer of humor to it? I wonder if you kind of have an answer to that personally. What value does it add to look at political, culturally significant moments through a lens of humor?
I think there's no better example of this than Ukraine right now with Vladimir Zelensky.
Yeah.
Vladimir Zelensky, a comedian by trade,
Yeah,
starring the show called Servant of the People, where he played a comedian who rose to power, became president. It's a great show in and of itself. Netflix put it up for free once all the shit started happening in Eastern Europe. To make something funny, to write something funny, to perform something funny, you have to know a lot about communication and a lot about how audiences are going to react. Because if you make, there's no worse feeling than a joke at a bad time. Bad timing.
Falls flat.
Right. Feels bad. Even if you're at a stand-up show and the comedy's bad, you feel just,
Yeah. Oh, I know. Yeah.
And you see in the way he communicates. And it's worth watching his speeches with this in mind, that through the humor lens, he's not trying to be funny, but he's very, very cognizant of the audience at all times. He talks about patriotism a ton when he's in America. He talks about building bridges and the world and globalization being a face against Russia in the UK. When he's talking to his own people, he talks very reassuredly. The greatest political moment, I think, of 2022 is Russia was trying to spread a disinformation campaign saying, oh, the president's left, the cabinet members left, everyone's left. And Zelensky posts a video to Twitter where he is surrounded by his cabinet and all the top political leaders saying, we are here. Me, the president, I am here.
Yep.
Him, the Secretary of Defense, is here.
Yeah.
And it just goes down the line. And knowing exactly what the audience needs is something every comedian, that's what they're working on. That lens there and that training he has in communicating in that style is so good to watch. Once you start to look at things from comedy, the stuff that goes into comedy, a lot more starts making sense.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking of my own answer to that question, what would that be? And I think you explained my version of an answer in the version of a story. And what I would say is that it adds context. And that's why you're pointing out, why he's focusing on different things in different contexts, in different countries that he was speaking to. Because like we've said, again, meaning is attached. And I think the way, if you're trying to understand what the meaning that is attached is, you have to look at the context, right? And so I think, when you get to say, okay, here's this news that I'm hearing from whatever news outlet, from whatever political figure, and take that as it is. And then also say, okay, well, what are people like comedians saying about it? What is the public saying about it? Because within minutes, you'll have, memes and a million opinions on the internet that are maybe even humorous. And so I think you could take whatever fact, but you don't know the meaning that it has in the context that it's in until you look to kind of these other places to help get you that answer of, okay, what is the context? How do the people feel about this? What is that fact? What is this event speaking into?
Without a doubt.
That is the end of part 1 of our conversation with Zev, but we will be coming back for a part 2, so be on the lookout for that. I think a great next turn for today, which of course is what we do after listening to this podcast, how we continue the conversation in our own lives and keep it growing and evolving for ourselves. A good next turn is, as always, to share this episode, to just keep bringing more people into the conversation, but also to start looking for stories in places where you don't expect it or where you haven't seen it before. That's what I'm taking away from this conversation with Zev, that I really would have never even tried to look for stories in the world of data science and analysis. But there's always layers to everything in our social world. That includes data, that includes politics. So I think it's a good practice to start looking for stories in unexpected or unfamiliar places. As always, I get to do this podcast with support from the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. They are my co-creators in our mission to create a better social world. We do this through reflecting on communication, learning the power of storytelling, and making new choices. So if those are things that you want more of in your life, use the CMM Institute page on my website to learn more about each of their projects or check out their own website, which I will link. As I said, please take the time to share our conversation with someone in your life. You can also follow the show wherever you listen. You can find me on Instagram at Stories Live Stories Told Pod. Find me on YouTube also for some additional content at Stories Live Stories Told. And you can also check out my website, storieslivestorietold.com. And please use any of those platforms to reach out to. I love to hear what this podcast means to you, so thank you in advance for sharing that and taking the time to do that. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. Until next time, I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.